Hi everyone, my name is Sid Branca and I teach in the Film, Video, New Media, and Animation department at SAAC. And I have a lot of different areas of interest, but one of them is thinking about science fiction and horror and how they can function as a site for thinking metaphorically about our experiences in the world. So for this triple feature of genre movies, I am presenting three films that I think are exciting to think about in conversation with each other. They are all American science fiction films produced in the 1980s and 90s that are set in a futuristic Southern California of the early 21st century. Demolition Man, which is the only feature film directed by video installation artist Marco Brambilla, released in 1993 and set in 1996 Los Angeles and 2032 San Angeles, which is the Los Angeles, San Diego, and Santa Barbara metropolitan area. And then Blade Runner, directed by Ridley Scott, released in 1982 and set in 2019 Los Angeles, loosely based on the 1968 Philip K. Dick novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And then we have The Running Man, directed by Paul Michael Glaser, released in 1987, set in 2017 and 2019 California. And that's loosely based on the 1982 Stephen King novel The Running Man, which he published under a pseudonym, Richard Bachman. So these are all pretty stylistically different films. Blade Runner is very much working with some of the hallmarks of film noir and detective stories, whereas The Running Man and Demolition Man exist very much in the realm of action movies, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone, so really action stars. But despite these pretty drastic differences in the tone and the aesthetic, the science fiction elements in all three of these narratives bring up some of the same questions and some of the same themes. So all three of them combine the use of speculative fiction with depictions of law enforcement and the use of technology as a means of controlling behavior. So the design of the replicants in Blade Runner, the technologies of video editing and manipulation and distribution in The Running Man, and the behavioral coding and various surveillance techniques in Demolition Man. These are all technological innovations used to manipulate the behavior of people who don't occupy positions of power. So in all three of these hypothetical futures, the advancements in technology are inextricably linked to policing and the criminal justice system and its efforts to suppress unrest that is directly tied to labor and economics and access to resources and rights. So something to think about while you watch these films is the ways science fiction and speculative thinking about technology and systems of governance can emphasize or expand on the political themes in a narrative. It's obviously like part of what makes these movies fun and visually striking, but maybe there's also a particular perspective to be gained by using science fiction to imagine metaphors for, or even kind of comically extreme examples of, circumstances that already exist. And something else to consider is maybe what are the limits to the imagination in these films, either deliberately or not. So in Blade Runner, it seems like we can envision a future with androids that are so advanced that they are indistinguishable from human life, but we can't envision a future without forced labor, without colonization, without dire economic inequality, and a whole class of sentient beings without rights. So the technological advances in space travel and in robotics and artificial intelligence, these innovations don't seem to impact those issues. So, and the world feels very futuristic, but also our main character feels very much like a protagonist from a 1940s movie. He's a detective with a drinking problem and problems with women and a sort of bleak existential despair. And then in Demolition Man, we have a society that seems to advertise itself as no longer needing police. The police force seems to have vast resources, maybe more so even than before, and they kind of sit around waiting for something to happen without seemingly questioning why their jobs even exist. Even in a future that is drastically different from the present, some of the basic structures of how society is expected to operate are still working with these assumptions that don't necessarily fit with the reality of the situation. The Running Man is maybe arguably the least serious of these films, but it has maybe the most bleak vision of the future, and specifically the blending of media technology and law enforcement. So, like, yes, it's kind of this like silly Arnold movie, but it actually feels very relevant to contemporary politics in a way that's not quite like any other science fiction movie I've seen. It can predict reality TV and like deep fake videos, and also not one but two of the athletes turned actors that are in this movie eventually became elected politicians. It's also worth noting that the special edition DVD of The Running Man has this documentary short film on like the Patriot Act and government surveillance post 9/11, that kind of maybe makes some of the political intentions behind the film a little more explicit, albeit in a way that's kind of confusing. And so in all of these films, there are these technological innovations that have like changed the world in maybe superficial ways, and then kind of constructions of capitalist ideology and constructions of like gender and behavior seem maybe fundamentally undisturbed. So we're presented with these worlds where the community seems really fractured and stratified, and the men are all really violent and the women are sort of painfully naive, and the police are ultimately there to make sure that wealthy people don't lose control over their property. And there's a fair amount of violence in all of these films, unsurprisingly. And the treatment of women includes some pretty rough language and some like challenging moments. So like be aware going in of that. And I think it's important that the protagonists aren't necessarily likable. And we maybe aren't necessarily like rooting for them the whole time. And I think it's also worth noting that the villains are sometimes much more fun, and have more personality. And also that all of these movies have these sort of nameless crowds of people who are just trying to survive. And maybe that's ultimately who we should be rooting for. And I don't think any of these films have super clear-cut politics. I think they're maybe all kind of muddled in that way. And I think that's part of why it's fun to think about them in that way. And I think the ways that we imagine the future looking can tell us a lot about the ways that we think about the present and the kind of assumptions that we have about how society operates. And I also just think all of these films are really great, albeit for very different reasons. So I hope you enjoy them. A quick just like nerd note about Blade Runner, to clarify. There are like 7 different cuts of this film. It's complicated, but sort of conflict between the studio and the director. So without getting kind of too bogged down in the details of that, the director's cut and the final cut are both good, and they have some differences, and arguments could be made for either one of them. But I would say the main takeaway is just to make sure you don't watch the US theatrical release version, because it has a really awful voiceover that the studio sort of made them add after. as well as like a couple of extra minutes tacked on to the ending. I don't think either of those choices are particularly in service to the goals of the film. I'll just put it at that. So as long as you're steering clear of a version that has like a pretty bad voiceover, you're probably good to like watch whatever version and have a conversation about it. Yeah, and so feel free to get in touch with me on Discord if you have any thoughts that you'd like to discuss after watching these films, or if there are other science fiction movies you'd like to talk about kind of in relation to these ideas, like RoboCop or Minority Report, or there's a bunch of other ones. Yeah, so I hope that you have a fun time watching these movies, and that these kind of introductory remarks give you something to chew on while you watch them. So enjoy.